I don't know if you've ever walked in gravel and sandals or across rock in sandals, but I could imagine trying to chase a sheep around a mountain range in just sandals. Probably gets pebbles under your feet quite a bit. I mean, you're sitting there running around and you've got this sheep that's missing. You know that it's missing because you watched it stray, you watched it run, and you got to go chase it down because that's your job. You're getting paid to watch sheep, and not just any sheep, but probably the sheep of the guy who's going to be your future father-in-law. And anytime that guy's involved, you can't let him down. But Moses just kept running and running and running through that mountainside, chasing after this sheep, and it just kept going and going further and further. The sheep got confused with a mountain goat, didn't know what it was anymore. Moses kept getting rocks under his sandals, stubbing his toe, holding his tongue, and then he could hear it, the crackling of the fire. And he looks towards the crackling of the fire, and he sees a bush that's not burning, but it's on fire. And he approaches the fire, and as he gets closer to the fire, it wasn't the warmth that took him back. It wasn't the size of the fire. And he was no longer amazed at the fact that the bush wasn't burning. It was the voice that spoke that struck him. Moses, take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. And he stares at the fire as it continues to crackle and pop. Moses, take off your shoes. This is holy ground. And so the shepherd bends down. He takes off his shoes. Now, come close. And he moves closer and closer to the fire. And the fire begins to speak more. Moses, just as you lead sheep, you're going to lead my people. It's time. I've heard their cries from on high. And you're going to lead them out of Egypt. And just like that, all of the excuses begin. Well, I have a speech impediment. Pharaoh won't listen to me. I can't even talk straight. I'll provide a spokesperson. This is Pharaoh. He thinks he's God. What power do I have? Pick up that stick. Bring it to me. This stick will manifest my power for you. Oh. Well, that's fine, but all the gods of Egypt have a name. You don't even have a name. I am who I am. So tell everyone that I am sent you. And just like that, that silly sheep that got Moses all stirred up and walking along this mountainous path with this incredible fireside encounter, comes back and down the mountain he goes. Moses, what's wrong? I'm not going to be leading sheep anymore. I'm supposed to go lead people. Well, where are these people? Held captive by Pharaoh for generations. 400 years, as a matter of fact. Could you imagine the encounter of Moses? I don't know what the campfire would look like in your life when God met you or called you, or what that moment was like. I couldn't imagine being Moses. Or maybe it's not the simple campfire. Maybe it's the thunderous crackling and popping as the sun set and the cloud transformed into a pillar of fire. We dared not even go close. I mean, we all have seen the devastation of fire. And yet this fire said it would lead us through the night, watch over us, guard us, take us to a land of promise. Or maybe it's the fire where, three young men who refused to bow and worship to these incredible statues that were throughout the city. When the trumpets would sound, everybody else would fall, but not these guys. And one day they were seen by the king's lead advisors, and they didn't bow down, and they brought them before the king, and he was so mad that he blew the trumpets again so they would bow in fear of him, but they said no. He said, make this furnace hotter than it's ever been. And they did. They cranked up the heat. They cranked up the heat so hot that anyone who got near to it would be consumed and die just by the temperature of the fire. And the three young men were thrown into this fire. And then there in the fire was a fourth person. And would you believe that no one was consumed in the fire? They were all walking around, right in the space where everybody else was being consumed. The three guys were met by a fourth guy, and they were walking around and singing and praising God. And they come out of the fire, but only three of them. And the king was amazed. See, maybe it's a fire you get thrown into that speaks so much to you. We start to watch fire throughout the Bible, all the way through, from beginning to end. And every time we see this fire, it's always telling us about God's presence. Always. God's presence that's with us, that speaks to us, that calls us, that guides us, that protects us, that purifies us, as we see, as the prophets speak more about fire. And you see, so many times we get so afraid of the campfire. We were building a fire last night. It looked similar to this one before it was consumed. And all the children are just kind of staring at it, and some of the adults, because we promised them at the end of our worship time we would have roasted marshmallows. Do you know how hard it is to keep a captive audience when you promise them roasted marshmallows? And the one phrase that was unique for every parent to every child was, be careful. Fire's hot, don't get burned. And every kid, all they want to do is get close to the fire. Can we sit on the big rocks? No, it's too close to the fire. Well, can we do this? No, it's too close to the fire. Can we do that? No, just sit here. And every kid was so drawn to the fire, probably because their parents said no, right? That in order to get close to the fire, they all began to find twigs and throw them just to stay connected to the fire. And then we had marshmallows. Now you can get close to the fire. Because a good marshmallow can only be roasted close to the coals. You don't put the marshmallow in the fire. Anybody fire toasted marshmallows? Okay, slow roll, golden brown, melty on the inside. Anybody like set that bad boy on fire and I'll blow it out and eat it? Charcoal crispy? Man. My wife is the most incredible marshmallow roaster of all time. She will reach into the fire and find one coal and just sit there and twist the marshmallow over the coal. Not really, but it's so meticulous. Yes. And it's perfectly gooey on the inside, golden brown on the outside. And would you believe that she is kind enough to offer me the first marshmallow? And I've got like 4 already in my gullet, you know? But there's this thing about fire, and when we get close to it, we benefit from it. There's warmth. If you get too close to it, you could get hurt by it. And maybe because of what we think about fire in the real world, our world, we forget that in the most real world, coming close to the fire is always good. See, fire symbolizes God's presence all throughout Scripture. And there are times that we want the warmth of God, the comfort of God, the presence of God, the protection of God, the guidance of God, but very few times do we really want the purification of God. Like there's stuff in our lives. Like if you took things and you got so close to a fire, the Bible talks about everything that is chaff will be consumed. You ever sit in your yard? Like when I was a kid, we had about, our immediate homestead was on about 6 acres of land. We had about another group that we crop shared with another farmer of over 100 acres. But like what we lived on was about 6 acres. Half of it was woods and half of it was grass where we could grow like crops for ourselves or feed the cows or the goats or whatever. But without fail, trees fall and leaves fall, and you have to burn that stuff. And you make a big fire, like a bonfire, and you just kind of watch everything just burn. And when you're a kid, it's kind of fun unless your grandfather calls it work, and then it's never fun, right? But we would make these big fires, you know, 2 or 3 people tall, and we would burn them, and we would just kind of watch everything on our property get cleaned up. You know, we bring with the tractor, we draw all the stuff up, and all the things that were in the way for the cows to eat or the ground to be tilled, it was just gone. Fire was the quickest way to clear something out. And yet, there's still this devastation that we think about when fire comes when we don't want it, right? We've had 2 friends close to us this year who lost everything in fires. One neighbor, one co-worker with Corey, and just to witness their homes and what they're going through. And if you've ever been in a house fire, it's absolutely terrifying. And the other side of that, the loss that nothing can really be replaced. Certainly the insurance check can buy new things, but the old things can't be replaced. And I think we see those kinds of things about fire, and we start thinking about God, and it gives us all pause to really get close to God. Because if we were to really come close to God in the fire, maybe, just maybe, the chaff would burn. And maybe we just like the chaff a little too much. See, the Bible also talks about once the chaff is burned, that everything that remains is worthwhile. And maybe some of us just think our whole lives are chaff. So if we really got close to God, what would actually be left? And we get afraid to really get close to God because we're afraid everything will be consumed. But if we did get close to God, have you ever thought about what would be left behind? If God were to be that that refining fire where everything worthless was removed, have you ever wondered what would be left? Have you ever wondered what would be worthy? What would be worth there? And at the core of that, to come close to the fire, for the chaff to burn, to see what's being refined, requires an incredible act of faith. If you're like me, there are days that you just like the chaff too much. You don't want it to burn. And some days we like the chaff because we're afraid of what's worthy. Because if we see what's there, that God has refined and purified and is called good, then maybe, just maybe, that might require something else of us. But so long as the chaff is in the way, we don't have to worry about it. I love Ephesians 2:10. We've talked about it at Cornerstone a little bit over the year, but Ephesians 2:10, God says that he has good works. He has made you for good works that he has prepared for you from the beginning. And at the middle, behind all the chaff, is the good work that's waiting for you. And when you look at the campfires and all the fire scenes in the Bible, Moses had to come close. He had chaff in his life. All the excuses he made. I got a speech impediment. I have no power. I have a God with no name. And God answered every single thing Moses threw at him. The people of Israel, as they're walking through the wilderness, experiencing freedom for the first time, no longer being oppressed by Egypt, the first thing that they do is they make a God that they can see. They make an idol because they couldn't see the God that Moses could see. So what does God do? He meets them with an image, a pillar of smoke by day and fire by night. Now you can see me. God continues to meet us at every space that we try to step away. And fire is completely symbolic of his presence. So where is God calling you to come close to him? Amazing things happen around campfires. Fantastic stories are told. Encounters are made. Memories are built. I loved what we got to see at the getaway over the weekend. Folks who have been a part of the Cornerstone family but haven't been around in a good minute came and hang out for the weekend. And it was beautiful to watch them reconnect. We got to watch a group of our elementary school girls all start fishing off the pier, and every one of them catching little sunnies at the same time. And they're all holding, there's a picture of all of them holding their fishing poles with fish on it. Some kids caught their very first fish. That was kind of fun to watch. People riding bicycles along, challenging routes that they didn't think that they could accomplish, and then they finish it, and what a great time that was. Just the memories that come with those things, and being able to share some of that around a campfire last night was great. But there's something more, I think, that God wants to do in us, more than just tell a story. I think he wants us to be the story. In order to be the story, we have to come close to him. It's more than just telling somebody else's story. It's living out yours. And coming close to God, being in his presence, that's where the story begins and continues and ultimately one day will end. But everything in between is about presence, is about refining, is about a life that lasts. At Cornerstone, we talk about this. Our vision is to be a space where people can connect with Jesus and his community. And that connection is that space where life really, really comes about. So many times we look at our own lives and we go, I don't know how this connection can be made. I don't know what in the world I'm going to do with this. There was a king. His name is Solomon. We find him, in particular, his story being told in the book of 1 Kings. Solomon's dad was David, and David was God's chosen king to lead Israel. The people had chosen a different king, and he didn't do very good. But he was tall and strong and handsome, and he had no character whatsoever. Remember that next year in the elections, okay? Character matters. So you've got this guy who's tall and strong and handsome, and he looks like a king. And all the people go, that's our guy, and he's terrible. Like, he gets into all kinds of trouble. But then there's this other kid, curly-headed kid, freckly, red skin. He's always out hanging out with the sheep. People don't they look, that's not a king. Even his parents didn't want to show him off. You ever seen a kid that a parent never wanted to show off? I mean, sometimes we become that kid, but when you're a little kid, and you're a newborn, everybody wants to show off their kid to everybody, even to the people that don't like kids, and you can tell because they're like, oh, it's your kid, great. Jesse didn't want to show David off. He brought all of his other sons. He left David, that curly-headed, freckly kid, out in the field. Samuel's like, you got another kid. Bring me the kid. This is the guy that God chooses to be the king. Well, that guy, David, he did a lot of good for God, but he wasn't necessarily a good guy. That happens sometimes. Gets into all kinds of trouble. Fights a lot. A lot of people die under David. Kind of a warring fellow. It's kind of hard to imagine that David would be kind of a warring king, because every time you hear David, he's like this shepherd, or he's got a harp in his hand. But God says, there's so much blood on your hands, David, you can't build my temple, but your son will. So his son Solomon becomes king. God gives him a gift. You can choose anything you want. What do you want? Solomon says, I want wisdom. So now God gives him this incredible gift of heavenly wisdom, so that Solomon was wise like no other king ever on earth, according to Scripture. And he builds these bathhouses that have 12 tubs, and these tubs are big enough to contain the waters of the Bronze Sea, we're told. And then Solomon is told that he's to build God's temple, and he gets stuck because he's in this space of going, I can build a bathhouse that can contain these waters, and I can measure them, but now I have to build a temple that's supposed to contain God. What in the world can possibly contain God? So in chapter 7, he's containing a sea, and in chapter 8, he's like, I can't build something that can contain God, because God is uncontainable. But uncontainable doesn't mean unapproachable, unrelatable. Because God would choose to enter into that space and meet with his people at the temple. Even though Solomon couldn't fathom, how can these walls hold God? And then ultimately, God chose to contain himself by emptying everything that was rightfully the Son's. That the Son would pour himself into human form, according to Philippians, enter into human flesh and bring the uncontainable love of God to all of us. It's always been about presence. God's presence. God's presence in the world, God's presence in your life. And whether that was in the image of a fire or in the flesh of a person, God calls us close to him. Just as the fire refines, Jesus refines. And he's constantly calling us close to him. no matter what's happening in life. The last campfire that Jesus was at, his disciples had just watched him die. The tomb is empty. One of them, Peter, no longer considered a disciple by Jesus himself. In one of Jesus' appearances, he said, "Go tell my disciples and Peter." How does that feel? Talk about judging others and pointing fingers. Go tell my disciples and Peter. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times. Peter doesn't know what to do. He's still hanging out with the disciples, even though he's like that Beatle that nobody remembers now, right? We all know who Ringo Starr is, but there was another Beatle before Ringo. Who was that guy? No one cares. Ringo took his spot. You probably know who it is. I don't know. No? Good. Makes me feel better. Doesn't make that guy feel any better, but it makes me feel better. Peter's like that guy. He's the guy in the band who's no longer part of the band, but he's still hanging out with them. And one day he says, "I got nothing left. I'm going fishing." Now, that's music to my ears personally. But what Peter was saying is, I'm going back to the life that I used to live before I started following Jesus, because I denied Jesus and he's gone. So I'm going fishing. I'm going back to everything that I used to know. It's a big statement by Peter. And so the other disciples go, "Okay, we'll go fishing too." Even the tax collector goes fishing. And they all get in the boat together. And they spend the whole night out there not catching any fish. May have happened a few times in my life. And then they get back, and it's early in the morning, and there's this guy, and he's got a campfire, and he's sitting on the shore, and you can see him kind of flipping the fish, or maybe because it's, he doesn't have a skillet, maybe he's just twisting the fish on a spick, and he calls out, "Hey, did you guys catch anything?" It's the thing I hate to answer when I haven't caught anything and another boat comes by where you are, everybody starts to talk. "Have you caught anything?" And you're hoping the guys in the other boat go, "No," because you haven't caught anything either. But when that guy goes, "It's my best fish ever," you're like, "Oh, great." And you really want to be excited for them, but then you look and you got an empty catch. And that's where these guys were. This guy on the shore is roasting fish. He's going to eat. And we've been fishing all night. We got nothing. And he says, "Hey, you should try the other side." And they do. And the nets fill up. And then Peter, who's no longer part of the band, but he's in the boat, going back to everything he used to know, remembers what he had been through before. Because the very first time he met this guy named Jesus, the very first time, the professional fisherman, Peter, had caught no fish all night long. Jesus says, "Have you tried the other side?" This is a carpenter telling a fisherman how to fish. That makes no sense. But they filled up the nets. And now there's a stranger telling the fisherman how to fish. And the moment the nets fill up, Peter dives in the water. Says he ties the nets around his own chest and he drags them in. Because he knew it was Jesus. He had had that encounter before. And he gets to the shore and Jesus welcomes him back into that space. See, some of us have gotten close to God before, and maybe we've walked away from God something, or maybe something in our lives have happened that have caused us to move away from God. Maybe God let us down. Like he died on a cross and was buried and disappeared. Left us with nothing. Some of us feel that way. All these promises, God left me with nothing. And there's hurt, and there's sorrow, and there's frustration, and yet it was at a simple campfire where Jesus brought all of those things back into view for Peter and completely restored him. And Peter got it the moment the fish got in the net. You see, Solomon knew he couldn't build a temple that could contain God. So God chose to contain himself, to be present in that temple. ultimately to be present through Jesus. And all of that, it's God's presence in our lives that makes all the difference. Whether you're like Peter, who is no longer part of the band, but just as quickly as he can makes it back to the shore. Or maybe you're like Solomon, who has no idea how in the world you're going to do what God's calling you to do. Or maybe you're like Moses, who makes all the excuses of why God can't do something in his life. Or maybe you're like David. No one else wants you to do anything for God. And yet God continues to come close to you to do amazing things in you and through you. He has prepared works for you to accomplish good works from the very beginning of time. And the accomplishment of those works begins by the presence of God in you. To be connected with Jesus and his community, to engage the world, to love God, and to love others. It's a campfire story worth telling one day. I can't wait to hear it from you.